Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we have a very special book, one of my personal favorites I've been dying to talk about for a while, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. Please grab a coffee, grab a drink, grab a glass of wine, whatever it is your preference, sit back and relax, and let us dive deep into the words of Dostoevsky. If we live in a world where there is no God, is anything truly wrong? If something is legal, can it be morally incorrect? If a crime goes unpunished, can it still be evil? In the timeless masterpiece, The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, one character lives his life as though God is not just absent, but non existent. He represents the question that has been asked for all of human history, which is, if there is a God, and that God is good and loves his creation, then how can a good God let bad things happen to good people? And this very question, while being central to one of the best arguments for the non-existence of God, followed to its logical conclusion, perhaps removes the foundation of morality that is provided by a loving and just God. And rather than making a philosophical claim injected with his own personal beliefs, Dostoevsky uses the characters and situations in The Brothers Karamazov as an experiment in which these questions are asked and tested. Moral experiment. The cast of characters in the novel include the father, Fyodor, a narcissistic and manipulative and sexual deviant who uses everyone in his life, including his own children, as a means for financial gain and self-gratification. The eldest son, Dmitri, having been treated the worst of all three of the sons, behaves wildly and impulsively, often getting into fights with strangers and spending what little money he has with pure, reckless abandon. The second eldest son, Ivan, has a slightly better relationship with Fyodor, but as he is the only son who went into academics, he is intellectually and spiritually skeptical. The youngest son, Alyosha, the apparent favorite of Fyodor, who lives at a nearby monastery, is a deeply faithful young Christian man who lives in service to others and only wants to grow in his belief in God and leads with love in all of his relationships. And finally, the servant and supposed illegitimate son of Fyodor, Smerdyakov, is resentful, devious, and nihilistic, and lives according to the maxim that everything is permitted. Each character represents different ways of believing and thinking, providing the narrative with ideologies that clash as they interact and wrestle with the looming spiritual questions I've already mentioned before. Ivan's philosophy. Now we get to the topic of Ivan and his worldview. As a student of science and academics, Ivan stands on reason and logic to the highest degree. As I said in the introduction, he believes that no benevolent God who cares about his creation could possibly exist if terrible things happen to good or innocent people, especially children. He uses several examples of wartime behavior that would make any normal person shudder. Plainly, Ivan cannot accept a moral system that exists in that world, and to him it's purely irrational and contradictory. Furthermore, Ivan conjures a story that he tells to his younger, faith-filled brother Alyosha, where Jesus Christ returns to earth as it says he will in the Bible, but he returns to Spain during the Spanish Inquisition. He begins performing miracles, but instead of being welcomed by the religious leaders of the time, he is imprisoned. His jailer, the Grand Inquisitor, visits Jesus and tells him that he was wrong about mankind and that they know better about what humans actually need. He uses the three temptations of Jesus by Satan to demonstrate his point. In the Gospels, Jesus is tempted by Satan 3 times, and each time Jesus denies him. The first temptation was for Jesus to turn stone into bread, something he refused to do because he wanted mankind to choose to believe in him rather than out of a desire for personal or material gain. The second temptation was to prove his divinity to mankind by performing some kind of spectacle. Again, Jesus refused. Lastly, Satan tempted Jesus to dominate the world with his divine power. Of course, Jesus refused. In the three decisions, the Grand Inquisitor tells Jesus that he was wrong about what was best for mankind. And since his resurrection and elevation to the right hand of God, the church has figured out what people really need. In contrast to Jesus' decision to refuse Satan, the church believes that what mankind really needs is security, structure, and control. Instead of the decision to choose good or evil, the Grand Inquisitor argues that the freedom to choose is too heavy a burden for ordinary people, and that they would rather have security and certainty. Instead of the knowledge of truth, they want structure and reliable comfort. Instead of freedom and uncertainty, they want to be controlled and their lives decided for them. He tells Jesus that Jesus loves humanity too much to control them, while the church loves humanity enough to control them. Essentially, he argues that Christ offered freedom, truth, and suffering, and they provided control, comfort, and happiness. In response to this lengthy monologue from the Grand Inquisitor, Jesus simply gets up and kisses him on the lips, and when the Grand Inquisitor opens the gate, Jesus simply walks out, doesn't say a word. This action represented love instead of argument and grace instead of logic. It was a rejection of the Grand Inquisitor's entire framework. And through Ivan, Dostoevsky stands up a powerful truth, which is that humans by nature might say they want truth, but their flesh and human desires often choose comfort, certainty, and someone else telling them what to do and what to think. And it's due to this tendency that powerful systems can often get away with controlling masses of people with the justification that it's for their own good. The problem with Ivan's representation of logic and rationality as a means to dismantle the existence and reasons to believe in God is that he doesn't replace the foundation of morality with anything else. His explanation leads to the removal of faith-driven morality, but it doesn't provide any meaningful substitute. The consequence of ideas. Now, up until this point, we've examined Ivan's ideas, existing purely in the theoretical space. But as he represents pure logic and rational thinking, Smerdyakov is devoid of any such structured thinking. His character has been granted the least recognition by their father, having grown up as hardly more than a servant in everyone else's eyes. The lack of love has led him to a state of nihilism and cynicism. And it's because of this lack of moral foundation that he adopts Ivan's ideas and he puts them into action. If there is no God, and thus no true basis for good and evil, then there is no ultimate accountability, and actions such as murder suddenly become justifiable. If you have not read the book up until this point, I strongly recommend you do so because, warning, spoilers ahead. It's through this logic that is devoid of God that Smerdyakov murders their father, Fyodor. Ivan, the intellectual progressive that he is, does not actually commit the murder, but he does provide the framework with which Smerdyakov carries it out. The underlying point that Dostoevsky here seems to be that ideas that provide the basis for morally relevant decision-making begin as abstract, but they never stay that way. Eventually, they get put into real-life action. Dmitri, morality without structure. Dmitri Karamazov, the eldest of the four sons, is a complicated character. Mostly because as Ivan stands firmly in the intellectual corner, Smerdyakov in the nihilistic, and Alyosha in the spiritually loving, Dmitri seems to exist somewhere all on his own. He's wildly impulsive, passionate, and chaotic. Given to fits of rage and violence, his uncontrollable jealousy leads him right to the edge of killing his father himself because they are both in love with the same woman. That being said, he's not completely detached from morality, even though he is very unstable and ideologically unsure. He shows a deep love and admiration for his younger brother Alyosha and his steadfast faith, but he does not carry in him the same sort of convictions. The contrast between Dmitri and Ivan is that Dmitri is emotional and chaotic, and Ivan is intellectual and measured. As we see from these ends of the spectrum, however, that both extremes can lead to fractured morality and ideas and actions that result in negative consequences for people around them. Alyosha, the counterexample. The youngest brother, Alyosha, stands grounded in his faith and walks out his days acting with compassion towards every person in his life. Despite the sins of his father, he gives him grace and forgives his misdeeds to him and his brothers. He devotes time to supporting local youth who are troubled and ill, studies under the guidance of a wise and respected elder at the monastery he lives in during the first part of the book, and is fundamentally someone who leads with love in all things. Unlike Ivan, he uses rational logic to guide his principles and worldview, and Dmitri, who lives according to chaos and wild, unpredictable emotions, or Smerdyakov, who operates without any guiding moral principles. Alyosha's faith grounds him in a foundation of moral clarity that produces a simple, consistent, and coherent love that he willingly and unflinchingly gives to everyone. The collapse of Ivan. Ivan's removal of God, and therefore good and evil from his worldview, gives rise to ideas that enable Smerdyakov to commit the evil act of murdering their father. Despite the fact that Ivan did not kill his father by his own hand, he nonetheless recognizes his role in his death. Psychologically, he is haunted, the seams of his mental stability fraying at first and gradually ripping apart completely. Regardless of this intellectual argument he attempted to convince himself of, the moral consequences bear down on his soul, progressively crushing his sanity every passing day. This dreadful process culminates in the nightmarish scene where one night he sees the devil in his room. The devil, who, instead of looking like a stereotypical demon with horns or a tail, actually resembles an ordinary man in ordinary clothes. He toys with Ivan, never fully confirming whether his presence is some sort of hallucination or not. The devil tells Ivan that everything is permitted, and that there will be a time where instead of worshiping God, people will worship themselves as their own gods on earth. The catch will be that this godlike existence will only be as long as their life on earth, and when they die, that is it. But the sacrifice will be worth it. He argues that pleasure is the ultimate good in life, and that it will be heightened due to the realization that no eternal love will come later. The scene is a sobering and terrifying reminder of what Ivan's worldview can subtly and easily slip into. While his intellectual framework that seeks to remove God from the picture doesn't necessarily prescribe this narcissistic or hedonistic belief system that the devil is describing to him, it does create a vacuum in the hearts and minds of those who hear it and may not know what else to fill it with. If they can't look to biblical foundational teachings from God for moral guidance, then where can they look? What solid moral framework can we come up with in the absence of God, be it the Christian God or any other? Ivan attempted to escape the influence of God intellectually, but perhaps he was not able to escape the weight of morality internally. The trial. Truth versus narrative. Dmitri is convicted of the murder, despite the fact that he was innocent. In the end, society was swayed by the narrative that felt true, and Dmitri was sentenced to 20 years of hard labor. The facts did not fully support his guilt, and yet the hammer of judgment came down on him anyway. Dmitri's conviction comes as a result of appearances, namely that he represented the exact suspect of someone who would have committed the murder. He hated his father, he publicly threatened to kill him, he was desperate for the money that he knew his father had, and his wild and violent antics all provided the perfect picture of guilt for the court to use against him. The case leans heavily on persuasion and interpretation of circumstances versus having conclusive proof of his supposed guilt. In truth, the murderer was Smerdyakov, but he wasn't present due to his taking his own life prior to the trial. Ivan learned of his guilt before the trial and even had a documented confession. However, Ivan's complete loss of self-control and mental stability on the stand lose him all credibility as a witness in his brother's defense, making him look like a man who is just losing his mind. So the trial moves on without taking the truth seriously, leaning fully in the direction that finds Dmitri guilty. The lawyers compete against one another, each crafting narratives in support or against Dmitri, neither of which are really just telling what happened. They're using personality and circumstance to present compelling arguments, but they are ultimately just trying to persuade the court instead of just simply telling what transpired that night. So Dostoevsky seems to be saying that moral truth does exist, but society can't always seem to get to it. As persuasion is so compelling to the hearts and minds of people, the best stories tend to win out instead of simply the truth. Does this directly tie to the question of what happens when we remove God from morality? Sort of, but really it's commenting on the tendencies of humans to embrace personal judgments and stories that resonate emotionally. People as individuals tend to struggle with discerning and navigating the truth, and so do societal systems such as judges and juries as well. Conclusion. The Brothers Karamazov is a masterpiece, and it takes on several themes such as the dynamics between faith and reason, the ethics of parenting, the weight of free will, and also moral responsibility. As we've discussed, Dostoevsky experiments with the notion of the removal of God from the foundational moral guidance that he provides. Through Ivan's rational doubt, morality becomes subjective, and in Smerdyakov, that subjectivity is acted upon, which leads to death and destruction. Dmitri's impulsivity and chaotic instability isn't rooted in anything, and he loses his freedom because of that. The only one in the story who maintains a healthy outlook and balanced emotional state is Alyosha, supported and guided by his faith. These are Dostoevsky's ideas, and the outcomes of every character according to their moral belief system and structure, or lack thereof, seems to be indicating that a belief in a higher power that requires accountability and love for one's fellow man, their brothers and sisters in the eyes of God, is an ultimate good for the prosperity of the souls of humanity. I believe he's telling us in no uncertain terms that removing God from our hearts, our minds, and society as a whole leads to more suffering, more loss, more unnecessary death and destruction, and the keeping of God provides hope, meaning, guidance, freedom, true knowledge, and of course, last but not least, love. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. If you enjoy deep dives into stories like this, you're in the right place. Please do consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, as it really does help me make more videos just like this one. Thank you so much for spending this time with me this evening as we have dove into The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky, truly one of the great masters of literature. He really does have a way with getting to the heart of things, and I hope that if you have not read this novel, this video has inspired you to read it anyway. It is truly worth your time, no matter if you know exactly what is coming next or not. I knew somewhat of the story before I read it, and having read it, it did not spoil it for me one bit. And I promise to you, if you have not yet, you owe it to yourself the sublime experience of reading Dostoevsky for yourself. And if you've already read him, you know what I'm talking about. Maybe he's not your favorite, that's totally okay. But to me, he is something special. His words truly like a gift to humanity and certainly to my life. Thank you so much for being here. It really does mean the world to me, and I will see you in the next video.